Greetings to our viewers, and thanks for tuning in to yet another podcast of Niti, the Policy Lab. Today's conversation is titled Below the Mask: Who Really Bears the Cost of Delhi's Air? A discourse that looks at air pollution not just as something we breathe, but as something that quietly shapes how we live, work, and move through the city. While air pollution affects everyone, its impact is far from equal. Some are able to shield themselves from toxic air, while others live in conditions where exposure is unavoidable, shaping health, livelihoods, and everyday equality of life. These uneven experiences raise deeper questions about the effectiveness of policy responses, the role of ecology, evolving public expectations around clean air as a right, and how cities like Delhi can chart a more sustainable path forward. To explore these questions, we are delighted to be joined by Dr. Disha Sharma, Assistant Professor of Sustainability Management at IIM Mumbai and an avid researcher in atmospheric science. She has also served as an air pollution expert with the United Nations Economics and Social Commission for India and the Pacific, bringing a global policy perspective to her work on India's air pollution, its links to climate and public health, and the adaptation of global mitigation strategies to the Indian policy context. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Sharma.
Thank you so much, Aditi. That was indeed very elaborate, and I'm very humbled by the introduction you gave. And I would, at the very outset, I would like to congratulate the students who are a part of NITI, the policy lab at Kirodimal College, for doing this very important podcast with me, wherein you would be asking me about air pollution, which happens to be a problem that all Delhiites and perhaps everybody living in India is very concerned about. It's a challenge that we all need to come together to address. So I'm very happy to be participating in this conversation with the students. And more importantly, I'm happy about the fact that somebody is taking an initiative because youth involvement is going to be vital in the longer run in fighting all the environmental challenges, including air pollution. So
Thank
thanks
you, ma'am.
again. Yes,
Thank you, ma'am. We are honored. Let's begin this discussion, and I think we should begin this discussion by acknowledging the fact that Delhi is one of the worst places to live in India, Asia, and even globally because of its poor air quality index. But even in Delhi, not everyone faces the brunt of this issue in an equal manner. Because of their socioeconomic status, many people face the brunt of this issue to the more extreme end. For example, me as a university student, my regular mode of accommodation is mostly by foot or in open rickshaws. And that is my worst interaction with this health hazard. That, for me, inevitably raises the question of those people whose livelihoods belong on those roads and highways. Like, for example, those auto rickshaw drivers or street vendors. And then, of course, there are the construction workers and the factory workers. This allows me to raise you this question that my first question that how does the phenomena of air pollution mirror the socioeconomic inequalities in Delhi by disproportionately exposing underprivileged societies to its toxicity?
absolutely. You're very right in pointing out that air pollution does not affect everyone equally. And that's because, the exposure levels differ. For example, somebody living in a posh locality in Delhi perhaps would have more means, would be safer in terms of the kind of exposure he or she faces and the kind of resources that are available to sort of, fight that exposure, be it the point of curtailing it by using air purifiers, staying indoors, staying informed for that matter, or having the resources to fight the ailments that result out of air pollution exposure, right? So there are definitely inequalities, and it is a very important issue concerning environmental justice. And the exposure varies depending on the social strata one belongs to. Unfortunately, it is the ones who do not really have the support of the system and who do not really have resources accrued and available to them to fight the issue on their own. Think of somebody living near a landfill site. The example that's coming to my mind is the Ghazipur landfill site, which often catches fire when the temperature increases in the summertime. So, other than, just living in a not so good neighborhood, it is the additional load of all the gases, all the pollutants that are emitted in addition And it is just those people who are living in the vicinity of such highly polluted locations. Then comes the case of those living near the highways that have constant exposure from road dust, from the vehicles that run on all kinds of fuel. You have vehicles coming into Delhi which do not meet the norms that we have applicable in Delhi. So, definitely, the exposure levels are different, and the way we all are sort of equipped to fight these different exposure levels is also something that creates the inequality. Perhaps this inequality is yet to be studied fully in a place like Delhi. We often have people who are more informed and educated about the issue take up the issue and come forth to sort of, bringing it to the fore and creating activism around it. It's not really the poor voices, it's not really those who suffer the most out of it, unfortunately, that have a voice in this issue, which is something very important. Second of all, they're also not the ones who are the most educated. So, outreach, exposure, awareness building perhaps is another way we can enable those voices to be heard. And third of all, it needs to become a issue, just like climate justice is a research issue. So there are several inequalities, as you rightly pointed out, based on the social rung one belongs to. And I would like to quote an example from London here. So what happened in London is a classic example of how air pollution, perhaps, even though we live in the same city, affects us differently depending on which part of the city we are living in, and second of all, the kind of resources we have available to us. So this is a case of London, wherein there was a family of color living near an industrial zone. And as a result of living in proximity to that industrial site, uh, a daughter in the family suffered from a very bad lung infection, which proved fatal. And the mother of that child, who lost her life because of that high exposure, fought for 9 years. Fought for 9 years so that she could have the coroner declare air pollution as the cause of death. We know that high exposure levels are very directly linked with negative health outcomes. But this was the first case where environmental justice was delivered by declaring air pollution as a cause of death. But this happened in London. So as I said in the beginning, that we all know that exposure is perhaps not equal, it is different, and exposure compounds the inequality in exposure compounds depending on the kind of social structure, the social hierarchy, the social strata we are a part of. And we definitely need to do a lot in order that, everybody gets equitable treatment when we have this discussion around air pollution. So yeah, perhaps it is something that needs to be looked parallelly with environmental and climate justice issues.
Right, ma'am. That really puts things into perspective, especially how exposure to pollution follows the existing social inequalities. Um, I hail from Uttar Pradesh, ma'am, and Uttar Pradesh has been a land of changing governments over the years. People have got numerous government in every 5 years, but the efforts that the government has put to curb the pollution differs in other cities. I come from Kanpur, and Kanpur is one of the most polluted cities in India. But if we have a look to the city Indore, government has also put efforts there, but the Indore stands in a good place as that of Kanpur. So this brings us to the next question. Despite multiple government efforts over the years, ranging from the odd even vehicle strategy to cloud seeding, Delhi continues to slip into emergency mode every year. In your view, are these headline measures genuine policy interventions or short optics during peak pollution periods?
Another very important and relevant question. So, what we have to understand is that air pollution is a very complicated problem. It's not that we have one source, and if we sort of abate it, if we put it to an end, it would solve the problem of pollution. We have multiple sources, and air has no boundaries, right? Whatever we emit outside of the state boundaries perhaps is also potent in affecting Delhi as a state, right? We know that pollution travels long distances. recently there was a volcanic eruption somewhere in the Middle East and it had far reaching impacts. Of course, it did not really affect the air quality, but that's just to tell you that air pollutants have the capacity to travel long distances. So perhaps it is this transboundary nature that adds to the challenge of solving it, to providing a solution that's long term. But you know, it's important to have a long term policy vision to solve the problem. But it has to be sort of complemented with some short term measures as well. So the measures you mentioned, cloud seeding, odd even, we implement GRAB. We've been doing that since 2016. We have 4 levels of GRAB. So these are short term measures. It's not wrong. These are no longer episodic measures, but these are the measures that are required when we have to respond to the issue on a short term basis. But that does not mean that we should not have a long term planning to curtail the problem. Long term planning has to have a better idea of which sources need to be prioritized in terms of, the regulations that we have to bring in so that the impact of those sources in particular, which are the most dominant in their contribution to air pollution mix in India and in Delhi. So I'll give you the example of China. We know that China has been successful in solving air pollution issue to a large extent. Why were they able to do it in a span of, say, around a decade and a half? And why are we still sort of, finding solutions, finding it very hard to essentially address this conundrum? It's because of the nature of sources that we have to deal with. In case of China, what happened was a lot of pollution, a lot of particulate matter pollution was coming from the use of coal even in the cities. And that coal was not being burnt in industries, it was being burnt in residential buildings for heating those buildings. So, they changed the entire infrastructure, they changed the entire heating system and made the heating run on clean energy. So they could solve a major part of their pollution problem, right? But in India, the story is a little more complicated because we have nearly 23% of pollution coming only from transport sector. It is the number of vehicles which actually translates into the number of people living in the city, right? More the people, more the number of vehicles. So it is the transportation sector which is the most dominant contributor, comes to around 23% according to the latest data which was submitted by the Commission on Air Quality Management to the Supreme Court. The second major contributor, of course, the contribution varies from somewhere from 5% to 27%, is dust. Dust is another big contributor. And how is dust generated? Dust could be generated in multiple ways, right? You could have dust coming in from unpaved roads, you could have dust coming in from construction sites, you could have dust being contributed from dust storms, which do not originate in Delhi but actually travel long distances, from Thar Desert, even sometimes across border, and then you could have dust getting generated as resuspended particles due to the vehicular motion. So it is the complexity of the sources that we have to deal with in Delhi, which makes it a little more complicated to solve the problem. So you pointed out that perhaps some of the strategies that the government adopts to address the issue may seem like, oh, they're not the right ones, they're not very pragmatic, the vision perhaps lacks, but we need a combination of both. In fact, there is evidence that shows that if odd even is implemented at the right time of the year, it could bring about some positive impacts because we know that air becomes extremely polluted during a certain interval during winter time when the wind speed is very little, the wind is almost not there, there is no moisture in the air, so there is hardly any possibility of rainfall. So what does one do? Think of yourself as policymakers, think of yourself as government. What do you do in those times? Other than implementing GRAB, you have to take measures like odd even, right? You have to shut down schools. You have to advocate people to stay indoors. So, in my personal opinion, whatever government is doing may look like, oh, these are haphazard measures, they're not really rooted in scientific fact, but a lot of thinking goes behind. And it is a combination of both short term and long term, myopic and, you know, broader vision that perhaps will help us address the issue better.
Very good insights, ma'am. This reminds me of the conversation I often have with my own mother. I live in Delhi and I complain that, oh, the school is not shutting off or we're not having online classes. The situation is so bad. And she always asks me, okay, but you're a political science student, you know? You can go on that bench one day. So why don't you tell me right now? What would you do? And that really humbles me. Like, yes, a lot of planning goes and all those short-term plus long-term measures is necessary. But I would like to point out that for us as viewers, as commoners, it does seem that there is a lack of long-term or stable policy measures. And most of the time, we have to resort to short-term or even emergency measures and tackling air pollution. Also, there is an implementation gap. Like, for example, I read in an article a while ago that only 33% of the clean air funds have been used in Delhi right now, even though it is such a big problem in this city. So, of course, there remains a gap. And while on one hand, the government is maybe failing or not being able to implement the protectionist policies so much, on the other hand, it was a big controversy recently that it is actively passing decisions in other related sectors that will actually aggravate the problem. Like we all know, air pollution is partly an ecological and a regional crisis as well. As you pointed out, we cannot ignore the facts of maybe the consequences of the neighboring cities of Karachi and Lahore, or we cannot ignore that volcano eruption that happened. So we also cannot ignore the fact of the importance of Aravallis, which acts like a natural buffer and helps with this issue of air pollution in Delhi. So that brings me to my question that to what extent has the weakening of natural barriers such as the Aravallis and land use change as well intensified Delhi's air pollution problem?
Very, very interesting question and very important as well. Very sort of suitable for this discussion, as I would say. And you were very right in pointing out that how perhaps, to a layman or somebody who does not understand the issue of air pollution, as well as some others do, perhaps long-term vision could seem to be missing. But that's actually not the case. There is definitely long term planning. We have the National Clean Air Program. In fact, now we are in the second term. The second version has been rolled out, and there is very clear focus on curtailing the pollutants that cause the most of the havoc, which is PM10 and PM2.5. In fact, the plan now focuses more on PM10. Coming to the question on, degradation of natural ecosystem, how does that relate to air pollution problem? On one hand, government is very ambitious on solving air pollution, not just in the capital city, but across India. And we also have the climate agenda, the net zero targets, right? So the government is sort of making headways on that as well. We have achieved all of clean energy targets, but how does then one explain, the Aravalli degradation? That's very rightly pointed out. We Delhi has a very unique topography, right? Unique topography in the sense that all the air that flows into Delhi, it sort of gets captured, or it stays there. It gets contained in that very geographical region because the airflow is hampered to an extent, and which sort of does not allow for a lot of mixing. But having said that, if Aravallis are to be sort of erased rather, so that would essentially add more dust load into Delhi. And I tell you why. Because air flows along a certain path, and we have identified certain airsheds over India. The World Bank clearly points to 7 airsheds over India, right? And one of the biggest airsheds is the Aravallis airshed, and it starts from Thar region in the west. So the air flows from there and crosses the entire Indo-Gangetic plain. So if we bring about any change in the natural structures, actually the Aravallis to say, which you were pointing at, so that would mean that the dust that travels towards Delhi perhaps would increase to an extent, right? So we should definitely not do that, because I gave you the figures that we have around 27% of the entire pollution concoction, the toxic concoction that we call pollution over Delhi, coming only from dust, right? So definitely, the natural structures should not be erased. Second of all, uh, dust is an important factor. So if you bring down any green patches, or we sort of create any changes in the topography, touch and disturb the natural ecosystem, then that would create an imbalance, because now we have very strong evidence that points to the role of plants in sort of, addressing air pollution. So we know that through the stomata, they have the capacity to take in some of the toxic gases, and of course, they act as air purifiers. So any change, any degradation to the natural ecosystem would definitely have a negative impact, and whatever planning the government does along the trajectories of development in the coming times should have a holistic take on all these ecological imbalances that perhaps could not just harm the natural ecosystem, but could also have an indirect impact on air pollution problem and even climate change, because we know that the green patches, the greens that surround Delhi, uh, they not only protect the city from air pollution to an extent, but they also have a positive impact on reducing the heat content, because essentially, plants act as heat absorbers. So there's a dual role here, and which also points to the need of looking at the problem through a co-benefits lens, right? We need to tap into the co-benefits of addressing air pollution and climate problem together. So the vision has to be broadened. We have to bring in the right set of experts who could point to these cross-cutting issues. And development should be along the lines of environmental conservation, such that we do not end up addressing one issue and then creating several other, sort of cross-cutting issues alongside. And yeah, because we have a very vulnerable ecosystem already in Delhi.
Yes, ma'am. This clearly highlights the role of topography of India in shaping both the policy and the other things, such as pollution, air pollution, or any other policy that the government is going to make. So, this brings me into the next question. That it's been 78 plus years of India's independence, and the youth these days has got a narrative shift. Earlier, people used to be not so political, but now they are asking for their rights. So there has been a visual shift in youth consciousness from broadly saying saving the planet to demanding clean air as an extension to right to life under Article 21. What is your take on these sharpening public narratives that place legal awareness as crucial for environmental justice?
This is another very important question. So this question becomes important because India happens to be the youngest nation, and we definitely have a very strong voice of the youth, right? Second of all, we know that there are these horrendous figures that point to how many people lose their lives because of the ailments that result out of bad air exposure, right? But what do we do with these numbers? How do we translate this information around, how harmful air pollution is for us, into something that has a message for the government? So this democratic demand for clean air perhaps has to be generated from youth, right? All college goers, everybody who's educated knows what is air quality index. Well, if not anything, you know when not to go to college and when to attend online classes. But the story doesn't end there. The story has to go further, has to stretch further to a point wherein the youth comes together and puts the pressure on the government to do something that has visible impacts, that has visible improvement, that brings about visible improvements in air quality. So I think the role of the youth is very important, and especially the youth in Delhi has shown solidarity on several social issues in the past. Right, we've had several candlelight marches taking place on India Gate. We've had people coming together to raise their voice against any social issue. But we need to see the similar activism, the similar spirit for this pollution problem that all of us living in Delhi and perhaps in most of the cities in India are facing 24/7, right? If you count the number of good air days that we have in the city, they're very few. So it means that most of the time, all the time rather, we are exposed to bad air. But why are we not really doing anything about it? So this somebody has to instigate us to take action. Somebody has to instill in that spirit in us to come together to show solidarity for all those who are coughing all the time, who are suffering from maladies that result from this toxic air exposure. It has to come, and I think it's very important and vital. And this is the time. It's high time that the young people of the city do something about it.
Truly, ma'am, I would like to point out that we have been more or so successful in our perception or in the philosophy aspect, where we see that air pollution is no longer just a governmental problem, it is actually a violation of our rights and it reduces the standard of our life, which, as we have included it under Article 21, gives that problem a space to become more enforceable solutions for that problem and makes the government more accountable too. I would like to, as a part of the closing remarks, tell you that, of course, that while air pollution has been added one of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is great because air pollution is a sectoral problem. It involves health, climate, infrastructure, and inequality. And you will be very authorized to answer this because you have worked with the UN specifically in the Asia and the Pacific sector. I would like to ask you that in the Indian context, how can clean air action be aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals to build a long term and sustainable roadmap connected to urban resilience, climate objectives, and public health?
So the problem of air pollution is addressed, as you very rightly mentioned, across several sustainable development, starting from health benefits to sustainable cities to climate action. You have air pollution consciousness embedded in several SDG goals and targets to say. When it comes to India, now India is also thinking along the lines of tackling one problem in a way that it also addresses another. So, for example, you have the EV policy. Just quoting the EV policy as an example. So, the EV policy is actually something that would bring about positive benefits both for climate as well as for air pollution because it will reduce the tailpipe emissions and it will also ensure that in the longer run we are more dependent on the clean energy if we start fueling those EV stations from renewables. So now we are getting that long-term vision to holistically look at all the problems and design policies that address them all. And this is all along the lines of sustainability because sustainability is not just one particular area to address. It starts from social goals and ends at environmental goals. And it is something that's designed for all species that inhabit the planet. So invariably, air pollution is a part of many sustainable development goals. And Indian government does have that sensibility these days as it is getting reflected in the co-benefits approach that is being taken. Another very important point to make here is now we have this term coined for pollutants that lie at the intersection of greenhouse gases and air pollutants. So essentially, when you burn anything, you're producing gases, and those gases they're a mixture, right? So some of those could be categorized as greenhouse gases, some of those could be air pollutants, which essentially the sources are the same. So now we are developing that vision. We've coined a term called SLCPs, which are the short lived climate pollutants. These have the capacity to pollute the air as well as harm the Earth's ecosystem. You have methane, you have soot or black carbon, you have tropospheric ozone, all a part of this category of pollutants, which we define as SLCP. So science is also directing us to a path wherein we are sort of able to integrate the impacts and the harmful externalities and take action that is more holistic and sort of, all encompassing in nature. Not just for sustainable development, of course, I mean, not just when it comes to addressing sustainability issues, but in general. So there's a lot of data driven insight into what needs to be done. So sustainability definitely now has a very strong component of addressing air pollution, be it from health perspective, be it from social inequality perspective, be it from climate perspective. So Indian government too is sort of aligned with that vision. And when we look into the policies in detail, we realize that yes, that vision is sort of getting emboldened and is reflected more clearly now. So it is rather a very positive sign that we are headed in a direction that perhaps is not just enabling us to solve air pollution problem, but also sort of equipping us to address climate issue, to address social atrocities, all for the benefit of all. Yeah, thank you.
So the coming of EV and sustainable policies and taking reference from other nations and adapting it our own Indian way could actually help us curb the air pollution problem that is in our nation. With this, to wrap it up all, today's conversation has been both illuminating and grounding. It helped us move discussion on air pollution towards deeper questions that shape policy, planning, and public life. We are grateful to Dr. Disha Sharma for sharing her time and expertise and for helping us think more carefully about what the need of clean air means in practice and not just in principle. To our viewers out there, we hope today's discussion stays with you, not as answers but as questions worth carrying forward. Stay tuned with Niti for more such conversations that make us pause, question, and reflect beyond headlines. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Abhi. Thank you, Aditi, and thank you, Ojas. I really enjoyed this conversation. You all had put some very interesting questions, and I hope that this recording reaches masses as you were pointing to youth participation. I hope this, in a way, enables that. So, thank you again. I'm very happy to have been a part of this event today. Thank you.